Anyone who's ever geared up for a sword fight, whether it's the full fit out for HEMA fighting or armored combat, we all have one thing in common. Inevitably, we've dropped our sword. And that causes a bit of a problem. You see, when you're wearing a glove or gauntlet, such as this Spec Heavy, it's really hard to pick up the sword. In fact, it's just flat out annoying. Now, obviously, this was a problem in the Middle Ages. So how did the medieval person solve for this? Well, they actually had a pretty standard and ingenious solution that, well, honestly, evolved right along with the sword, and yet we've mostly forgotten about. I'm talking about the sword knot. Anyone who's ever studied or even looked at modern military sabers, and I'm really talking about the large stretch of what I mean by modern from a historical standpoint, knows what a sword knot is. And it's very often considered a decorative, ornamental affixment to most of these swords, but it has its roots historically in a very distinct and practical purpose. And that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. You see, whether it was on the battlefield or in the tournament, dropping your sword would potentially cost you quite a lot. The time it would take to just reach down and pick up the sword could cost you the tournament, the valuable points, or even your life. And that is something that was very seriously considered in the Middle Ages. And we see this actually quite often historically as well as in reproductions, such as in this kind of three-fingered hand grip warhammer with this nice little thong on it. And it has an express purpose. You slip your hand through it, and then you have the weapon. And as you're fighting, if it drops, it stays on your hand, and you can quite easily get it back into your hand. We all recognize that's the purpose of this thong. However, we very often don't see that on swords. So I took the time to recreate a sword knot that is the medieval variant. This isn't quite entirely accurate because there are a couple different styles of sword knots based on how you're affixing it to your body and for what purpose. But I wanted to speak to it because I do think it is something that is very often missed. And in this book, which is A Knight and His Weapons by Ewart Oakeshott, he actually talks about the sword knot from the medieval standard. I'm going to read this to you. He says, "Quite often swords in battle were loosely fastened to the warrior. In some cases, a ring was around the grip, loose so it could run up and down freely. A light chain about 3 feet, 6 inches long was attached to the ring. The other end of the chain was fastened to the breastplate, so if your sword got knocked out of your hand, you didn't lose it. Another method was to wear a sword knot, a loop of leather thong or similar material that was fixed to the sword hilt and slipped over the wrist." So what I've actually created here is a bit of a dual-purpose version. Generally speaking, an actual proper sword knot would not be nearly this long, but I created it so I could kind of give the examples. And I'm going to use this blunt training arming sword. You see, it would just loop over the grip, right onto the hilt, and you would tighten it up, and there you go. It is now affixed to the sword. And if you had it affixed to your breastplate, then it might attach, say, to where your shoulder is. That would give you all the reach you need to fight. Of course, you could run some risk of getting tangled up, but that seemed to be worth the risk for the most part, because if this dropped, even if it went all the way down to the ground, you could quite simply pull the sword back up and you'd have it back in your hand relatively quick, not having to bend over, not having to risk valuable time to try to pick it up off the ground. And there's a distinct value to that. I also made this out of this type of kind of leather braided thing because it's based on an image that's part of a tournament book. And I'm going to read from that. This is King Rene's tournament book, and he talks a little bit about what the weapons in a tournament should look like, specifically how they should be designed and for what purpose. But he says this about the sword knot. He says, "And if you wish, attach a light chain, braid, or cord to your sword or mace around the arm or to your belt, so that if it escapes your hand, you can recover it before it falls to the ground." And again, the express purpose of that would be, I'm holding the sword, I can affix it to my arm, I'm doing a quick job here, and it's relatively long, so it of course wouldn't be that long. It'd probably be only maybe a foot and a half long or so if I was actually using this as purely a tournament style sword. But again, this is the type of thing that once affixed, if it were to fall, it's right there near my hand. I can get back to it relatively quick. And this is a thing that, well, I mean, I believe a lot of people used, and we have evidence to suggest that it was a pretty common practice. In fact, going back to Oakeshot's book here, he actually gives a little bit of an amusing anecdote. He says that Jean Froissart, a chronicler of the period and contemporary of Chaucer, relates a rather amusing incident when a knight got himself into serious difficulties because of his sword knot. He says, the lords dismounted and approached the barriers, which were very strong, sword in hand, and great strokes were given to those within, who defended themselves very valiantly. The abbot did not spare himself, but having a good leather jerkin on, dealt about his blows manfully, and received as good in his turn. Many a gallant action was performed, and those within the barriers flung upon the assailants stones, logs, pots full of lime to annoy them. So you can imagine there's a bit of a barrier that's separating the attackers from the defenders. And then he goes on to say, it chanced that Sir Henry of Flanders, who was one of the foremost with his sword attached to his wrist, laid about him at a great rate. He came too near the abbot, who caught hold of his sword and drew him to the barrier with so much force that his arm was dragged through the grating, for he could not quit his sword with honor. Gotta love the way they wrote in the Middle Ages, even with the translations. He goes on to say, the abbot continued pulling, and had the grating been wide enough, he would have had him through, for his shoulder had passed, to the knight's great discomfort. So he's right up to his shoulder being pulled through this grate because his sword was affixed to his arm. On the other side, his brother knights were trying to pull him back, and this lasted so long that Sir Henry was sorely hurt. He was at last rescued, but his sword remained with the abbot. And while I was writing this book, I passed through town, and the monks showed me this sword, which was kept there, much ornamented. So it's not to say that the express purpose of a sword knot or a thong was necessarily always a good thing. It was certainly a trade-off, but it was a thing. And I think it's worth noting because I think there's some distinct value in that. I know that generally speaking in something like a HEMA tournament, we like to have our sword disarms, but I have more than once seen a sword come awfully close to the spectators. In fact, if HEMA tournaments had been football games or baseball games, I would have actually gone home with a sword once that landed right near me. But alas, I gave it back. But if these things were affixed to the body in some way that allowed for disarms to occur while not allowing the sword to go flying, that might be a good thing. In fact, I would suggest it would be a good thing for even things like cutting tournaments or uses of the sword where there are spectators around and you don't want the sword for any reason to slip and get away from you. Sharps are a little bit more concerning if you're not wearing armor, though, because that thing flying out, coming back around to you, a little bit scary. Anyway, I thought it would be an interesting thing to talk about. It's certainly an often forgotten element of medieval swords, and we really only ever see it in the modern military sabers, and it's an ornament. We kind of forget its purpose, but it did exist, and might still be useful to us today. Cheers, guys.